What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my rankings for all the TRPGs I have reviewed, which, for those who don't know, I keep a sort of running ranking of all the CRPGs and TRPGs I played, as those are my favorite genres typically, which is why I review so many of them. But to that end, my CRPG video has only had a couple of extras since that was put out, so I'm not ready to update that one, whereas this TRPG video, I've added a full 9 since the last time. But it is important to mention that currently I have not reviewed a lot of, I would say, hallmarks of that genre still, things like XCOM, Final Fantasy Tactics even, etc. So in some of those cases I have actually played those games, I simply haven't reviewed them on the channel yet, which is why they are not on this list. But obviously, as this video should tell you, as I review more of these games they will get added in, as I make significant progress in reviewing as many of them as I can. But to that end, we're here today to talk about the 32 that I have reviewed, so let's get on to those. But as a quick mention before we officially start, if you want my full thoughts on any of these, I have in fact reviewed them, so you can of course go find those reviews. Because here we're going to be moving fairly quickly so we can get through all of them without being here all day. But that starts us off at number 32, which is Empire of Sin. So Empire of Sin puts you in the role of one of several different Chicago gangsters all the way back in the 1920s, and this is a game that does a lot of things okay, but nothing particularly well, and as a result it's a game that's hard to sell to basically anybody because the things you might want out of it really aren't that great, such as its turn-based combat or sort of mild 4X strategy elements, and as a result it kind of just comes across underwhelming. Which brings us to 31. 31 for me is actually King Arthur, A Knight's Tale. This is a TRPG I could just never quite get into, and while I am certainly not opposed to a dark, gritty take on Arthurian legend, I didn't love the mechanics of this one, in particular how spiky a lot of the difficulty can be from act to act as you have to sort of re-gear yourself, though I will say they did make a sort of standalone expansion to this one that I enjoyed more, but alas, this sort of base game here didn't quite land for me, which is why it is so low. Now 30th on the list we have Flint, Treasure of Oblivion. This is a very short CRPG that I reviewed earlier this year. It's about a 10-hour experience and it is extremely linear, and the main thing it has going for it is some interesting, unique elements in terms of its TRPG combat, but even that is presented a little bit on the clunky side. So if you love TRPGs, I think it might be worth checking out just to see some of the systems here that are a little bit unique that I haven't seen elsewhere, but otherwise a very, very small game. Now just ahead of that we have Lamplighter's League, a game from Harebrained Schemes, the team behind the Shadowrun CRPGs, but in particular this game is actually what wound up being the catalyst, I would say, for a separation between Paradox Interactive and Harebrained Schemes, as it was not received particularly well, a lot of which had to do with the game's poor performance. Now, on the face of it, it's an interesting sort of noir-inspired Cthulhu Mythos-esque TRPG that has some interesting moments, but beyond that, it doesn't really do much to stand out, which is why this one never really got off the ground, though. But again, if you're an enthusiast, certainly the kind of game you might want to take a look at. Now, coming in at 28, we have another small one with Iron Danger. Iron Danger is a TRPG with a very unique combat system that allows you to manipulate time in various segments, like sort of backing it up and fast forwarding it as you try to work your way through various scenarios while keeping your people alive. It's got an interesting story to go alongside that, and honestly its main mechanic is pretty fun to mess around with, but again, another relatively small experience that I would be shocked if it took you more than like 10 hours. But next up we have Othercide. Othercide is a great indie TRPG that I do think runs on a little too long, not least of which because it uses roguelite runs where you'll be running the same areas over and over again as you reincarnate more of your daughters into various classes and mess around with those mechanics. Now, visually this game looks very cool, mechanically it works really well, but what you see is what you get. There's really not much more to this one. Which is why, just ahead of that, we have Crown Wars, The Black Prince, a sort of medieval XCOM set during the 100 Years' War, that on one hand has a lot of stuff going for it. I liked a lot of what I played in terms of this game, from utilizing the environment in your battles to actually upgrading individual characters to make them more interesting to play, but unfortunately it does suffer from a fair bit of performance issues and some lack lack of quality life stuff that prevents it from being a little bit higher. Though they are still actively patching this one, so it might eventually get to a much better place, with the latest patch being just back in December, actually. But if you're willing to get past that, this one's a lot of fun. I think the progression in particular is pretty solid. Moving right along though, next up we have Capes. Capes is a superhero TRPG centered around a city that has been lost to supervillains, and our superheroes have to fight to get it back. And for the most part, I would say this one is pretty enjoyable. The only real complaint I have is that I wish you would get all of your heroes a little bit faster so you could mess around with them more, and that's when the game really opens up, which is especially important because this is one of those games that tends to be more on the puzzle tactics side of things, meaning that, there's a sort of puzzle scenario going on and you need to sort of decode that in order to make progress, and there's a bunch of challenges associated with each hero in particular, so there's that. But if you like that sort of thing, it's pretty fun. Then coming in at number 24, we have Circus Electrique, a very unique TRPG, kind of in the vein of like Darkest Dungeon, but in this one we are instead overseeing a circus in Victorian-era London, fighting off steampunk abominations that have taken over the city during the nighttime, so we need to use our performers to combat that and get to the heart of what's going on here and try to solve that problem. Now, while I enjoy this game a lot, it does have, I would say, a very unbalanced difficulty curve, meaning that the game gets extremely difficult right towards the end for seemingly no reason, and doing that on top of starting to run out of steam at the end is what it's doing a little farther down. But it is a very fun, unique game. I love the aesthetic of it, and I've had a lot of fun playing it. But speaking of a game I love the aesthetic of, we then have Wildermyth. Wildermyth is a really interesting game in that it has a bunch of really well-defined and honestly somewhat simplistic tactical elements, but that is wrapped around a sort of procedural system that generates a lot of character interactions between your various people. Somewhat recently, this game got a really big expansion called Omen Road, which is somewhat interesting because the developer kinda sort of closed down afterwards. Not exactly. Basically, they wanted to finish Omen Road before they sort of closed their own doors, with the idea being that if they ever find another project that they are particularly passionate about, they will open back up and start working on that. But for right now, they are done, and they went out on a bit of a high note. I liked Omen Road a lot. Wildermyth is cool, and you should check it out. But then we have Tower of Time. Tower of Time is a very cool game. It recently got a sort of indirect sequel via Dark Envoy, and both of those games use a very unique system where you get to sort of draw the area of effect on certain abilities, which is a fun mechanic to mess around with in what is otherwise a real-time with slow game, which is relatively rare in the TRPG space. There's a few, but you don't see many of them. And to top it all off, Tower of Time actually has an incredibly interesting story that's worth playing through the game for all on its own. I will say some people tend to call this one a CRPG in some cases, but I would say it's really more of a TRPG myself. But that is simply semantics. Next up, however, we have Rogue Waters, a relatively recent game that is all about being a pirate, utilizing the powers of the sea in order to take on sort of roguelite elements yet again, including both ship combat, but also actual battles on the deck, and how you approach ships and interact with those ship battles then affects how much you have to deal with in terms of the actual tactical battles. And then you can also summon in like sea creatures and stuff. It's a really cool little experience. It's a game that knows exactly what it wants to be, and it doesn't overstay its welcome, which made it pretty fun. Just ahead of that, we've got the DioField Chronicle. The DioField Chronicle is another real-time with pause TRPG, which again, fairly rare. And what's more, it actually has a lot of really interesting systems. Now, when I played the game, it was almost laughably easy, and some of the ideas needed work, but the core idea of it was really cool to me. Now, since then, they've actually added a difficulty mode that I have not messed with personally, so it is a neat game worth checking out. There's actually a demo on Steam if you want to see it before you actually pay for it, as it is a little bit expensive, which I noted in my own review for it, but otherwise, some cool things it's trying to do. Getting close to the middle, we then have Classified France 44, a game that is a sort of alternative history around D-Day in World War II, where we play the role of a team of Jedburghs who drop into the general area there and start building up resistance, which means a lot of the missions in this one have to do with stealth, but also just straight up firefights at times, and then how well you do overall all leads to varying outcomes for D-Day itself, and it's a really fun experience, especially if you like alternative history type of stuff. It's a little further down though just because of some general jank, and it could definitely use a little more polish as a result of that, but it does a very specific thing and it's a lot of fun. Speaking of a lot of fun, however, we then have Hard West 2. Hard West 2 is one of the, I would say, several different supernatural Wild West games that came out in like 2022, but what's really cool about it is actually its progression systems, which revolves around collecting poker cards and then assigning them to a character in order to make a poker hand. And then how good that hand is determines like stats and stuff, which is a really neat little idea. It's got a lot of atmosphere and a great aesthetic, though it is, again, a game that leans a little high on the puzzle side of things, though they did loosen that up a bit after launch. Now, a game that is extremely heavy on the puzzle side of things is Mutant Year Zero. Mutant Year Zero is really all about sort of deconstructing a general situation in terms of combat so you can absolutely maximize your effectiveness, which is required on harder difficulties. But combine that with a really great aesthetic and an interesting story to go with it, and it's a pretty good time overall. Really, my only gripe is it's probably a little too rigid for my taste overall, but still pretty fun. Then we have Triangle Strategy. Triangle Strategy is a fantastic little TRPG that I sunk almost 100 hours into trying to get all the endings and everything, which is really where that game shines the most. It has a pretty elaborate story that in order to see all the different sides of, you're going to have to play through it several times. But that hopefully won't be too much of an issue because the individual scenarios and progression that game offers are a lot of fun. However, I will say that the story is extremely heavy in this one. There are times where you'll go like an hour or two just listening to cutscenes and stuff before you actually get into a battle. But luckily, I do think it is worth it. Just ahead of that, however, we have Marvel's Midnight Suns. Midnight Suns is an interesting game because on one hand, I loved the combat despite not thinking that I would, given that it's all card-based. It's actually a really cool little combat system they've set up for that is both reactive in terms of the environment and stuff, but also allows you to build the individual heroes your way. But unfortunately, the other system, the sort of friendship simulator with all the different heroes back at the base, was not really my jam at all. Honestly, I think the combat sort of hard carries this one, at least for me, so it still gets a decent spot. Now, a game that I think handles a genre shift especially well is Gears Tactics. So this is a game that takes the Gears of War franchise and turns it into a TRPG, and a surprisingly great one at that. I'm not wildly into the Gears of War franchise, but people knew that I liked TRPGs and they kept recommending this one to me, saying that it was surprisingly good despite the franchise, not really being about TRPGs. But there's two things that can be a little annoying. For starters, you have to have an Xbox Live account to play this one, despite the fact that it's a single-player game that shouldn't need one. And secondly, unfortunately, there's just not a lot of content in the game itself. It's a little bit on the short side, but it is a really great ride for what is there. Bringing us into the top 13, however, we then have Warhammer 40k Mechanicus. Mechanicus is another TRPG that knows exactly what it wants to be, and it does it very, very well. And once you get a grasp for how the various mechanics works, you can pull off some incredibly fun stuff with all of your tech priests and all of the customization that naturally goes right along with that. In fact, this game was so well received, they wound up announcing a sequel, which will hopefully be out sooner rather than later. And in the meantime, this one is definitely worth checking out before that one drops. Coming in at number 12, however, we then have Miasma Chronicles, which is a game from the same people that made Mutant Year Zero. With this one, somewhat learning from the shortcomings of Mutant Year Zero, however, Miasma Chronicles is a little more ambitious, not least of which graphically, but also loosens up a little bit of that rigid structure I was talking about in the previous one. Now, there's certainly still a little bit of that, and you have to be smart about how you approach various things, but you do have more options for starters, and I also thought the story itself was really interesting as well. But what would this list be without having at some point mentioned Tactical Breach Wizards? Tactical Breach Wizards was a very, very well-received TRPG from just earlier in 2024. It's a game that featured, I would say, great writing, just individually great stories with all the characters, and then how it weaves together with all of these magical elements being combined with a more modern day society and especially tactical forces, as you might imagine. So it's a very, I might be out of spells, but I'm not out of shells situation. And while it does lean a little bit heavy on puzzle tactics for my own personal taste, it is really fun in spite of that. And I think if you're looking for a great picture of what this genre can be, it's definitely one of the must plays. Bringing us into the top 10, however, we then have Warhammer 40k Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, which is a name for a game it is entirely too long, but luckily the game is good enough to make up for it. In this one, we play as the Grey Knights, as they hunt various demons and forces of chaos across the vastness of the void. I really enjoyed this one. The DLC that added on to it and let you play things like a Dreadnought, for instance, are a ton of fun. I think they really did a good job of fleshing this one out as they developed it, and with its post-launch support as well. So while it can get a little bit repetitive in places, I do think it's a great game, and I really enjoyed it. And just ahead of that, though, we then have Lost Eidolons. So Lost Eidolons is a sort of Fire Emblem-like, and if you enjoy that kind of tactical game, you'll probably enjoy this quite a bit. That combined with a really solid challenge that felt difficult yet rewarding at the same time, and I think you've got a fantastic game. But it does have this sort of third-person mode in between missions where you'll run around your sort of base camp, and that in particular could struggle for people in terms of performance, which is probably worth mentioning. But the actual tactical portions of it were on point, and I enjoyed it a lot. But then we have Wartales. Wartales is a fantastic TRPG that is, I would say, somewhat similar to Battle Brothers, at least in the sense that we are leading a mercenary company across a very long journey across individual provinces or counties, and they all have their own little stories to go through, and it's an immense game with a ton of tactical elements to get through and a whole lot of systems to get to grips with. But as a result of that, it's a very deep game, and the DLC they have put out since the game launched has only expanded upon that. My personal favorite was the Pirates of Balerion, but they've also put out a Tavern DLC, an Arena DLC, very recently a Barbarian Invasion type DLC via the Skelmar Invasion. So despite coming out all the way back in early 2023, it's still getting a fair bit of content. It's an immense game, and while it can certainly be a bit demanding of your time, it's a great experience if you manage to give it that time. Nonetheless, though, we are still a little ways from the top. Coming in at number 7 with Phantom Doctrine. Phantom Doctrine is a really interesting game in that it is actually a sort of stealth TRPG. If you do everything perfectly, you can get in and out of missions without ever being seen at all. Now, things can devolve into a firefight, and you can take part in more traditional turn-based tactics, but what I really loved about Phantom Doctrine was what it let you do before you even get into a mission, which is set up all sorts of crazy scenarios that allow the espionage to take place, such as sort of indoctrinating spies in order to turn them with control phrases and stuff, doing research, getting your characters disguises so they can, walk up in proper stealth and assassinate people that way, all of which makes for a really unique experience in this particular space, which is always a winner for me at least, which is what it's doing so high up on the list overall. But then we have Showgunners. Showgunners is a fantastic game. I enjoyed this one a lot. It is a little on the short side, and truth be told, it's a little on the easy side as well, but Showgunners is basically a running man TRPG. We are playing in a game show where people move through arenas where they will very likely die, all for everyone else's entertainment. And as the game goes on, you gain fame and everything, and you get to sign autographs and stuff, which serves as a form of progression. You get sponsors and whatnot. And when you put it all together, Showgunners is such a fantastically put together experience that it really does just sort of steal the show when you play it, which is why it is so high up. But just ahead of that, we then have Metal Slug Tactics coming in at number 5. Metal Slug Tactics is a game that surprised me because it's sort of revival for the Metal Slug series, this time as a TRPG, and basically we run through a little roguelike scenario where we take some of our unlocked characters and our loadouts through various TRPG battles as we try to stop the general who's taken over the city of Sirocco. But what I really loved about this is how you take 3 of the characters you unlock with you, and each and every one of them has a ton of really fun synergies with all of the other characters, and what I enjoyed about this was sort of figuring out what worked best where and how to combine all of them to get successful runs with basically everyone, and that combined with a difficulty that can just be continually pushed until you're at your limit made for a really great overall experience. And yet, in spite of that, there are still games that I loved even more than this, and that was Aliens: The Dark Descent at number 4, which is a game I was really impressed with because they managed to take the sort of fear and horror that goes along with something like the Aliens franchise and translate that so perfectly to a TRPG, which very much so surprised me. Now, this is another one that uses uses a real-time with pause system, which again, a little bit rare in this genre, but it does happen. As you would imagine in the Aliens franchise, it's not the easiest system to get to grips with. You are vastly outnumbered by the aliens, and you have to be real smart about both monitoring their positions on the map while also trying to avoid being seen and then extracting where possible, while still other times having to fend off waves of these things as you wait for an extraction or an objective to complete. And it is a game that nails its atmosphere while bringing mechanics into the experience in a way that just perfectly meshes with what the game is supposed to be. It really is a great one. But that brings us to the top 3, and in the number 3 spot we've got Tactics Ogre. So Tactics Ogre is one of those games that I think kind of early on defined what the TRPG genre was going to be, and in particular the one I'm talking about happened to be a remake, Tactics Ogre Reborn as it were, which made it a little more accessible back in 2022 while retaining the core of it, mind you. But I don't think it takes long of playing this game before you realize just how incredibly in-depth the systems are and how varied all the options of approach are for you to actually mess around with. It's a tremendous game, which is why it's been remade a few different times actually, and is still considered one of the best TRPGs out there to this day. But nonetheless, there are 2 more that I enjoyed more than that one. And in the second place spot, we've got Jagged Alliance 3. Jagged Alliance 3 is one of those games that kind of blends its TRPG elements with bordering on a CRPG. Now, in the case of Jagged Alliance 3, I would still say it's more of a TRPG than anything else. But given all its side stories and, situations that actually have multiple outcomes based on what you do, it's definitely right around a CRPG as well. But in any event, it's a great game where we play a role of different mercenaries hired to protect an island known as Grand Chien. It is very much so inspired by all sorts of 80s action movies, and as such, basically everything you do is extremely over the top, and it's a game with a wealth of really interesting systems, fun combat, and great stories, which is why it is number 2. But that does leave us with our number 1 title, and this is, in fact, still Troubleshooter Abandoned Children. A very unique title that puts you in the role of what are effectively licensed vigilantes known as troubleshooters who go around investigating and arresting criminals in a very crime-ridden city known as Valhalla. Now, while the story can be a little bit incoherent at times, what makes this game so good is its incredible depth. There is so much to this game, it's kind of hard to fit it all into any amount of explanation, but you can certainly see me try my best in my review of the game. But I called it a must-play then. I remain of the mind that it is still a must-play for the genre, because very few games have nearly as much depth as this one does. Somewhat excitingly, I would say, the developers behind this one are actually already working on their next project, Troubleshooter Banished Children, and you better believe I will certainly be covering that one because I really enjoyed Troubleshooter, and I'm excited to see what this studio can do with even more time and an expansion of an already fantastic core. But that should finally put us at the end of the video here, where we will wrap it up. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. I would love to know what you think about all these games individually down in the comment section below. But speaking for myself, I think it will be fun now that I've gotten all these in here to actually go back and start running through the greats that are notably absent from this particular list, which is what I'm hopefully going to be trying to do this year, and seeing where those wind up stacking up against all of these TRPGs, because at least as far as this genre goes, I really do still have a lot of games to get through, and I'm certainly excited to do so. But if you're looking forward to any of that, or you just want to tell me all about these games and how you feel about them, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.